comes the fall, and then the flood, and then the nations. And then 4,000 years ago, when a place called Ur, which is near the Persian Gulf, which would taste like salt, that reminds us of Sarah, Abraham, Lot, and Sarah, who go down the Tigris and the Euphrates to a place called Haran, and that's where Terah died. Now let's remember our map. We have the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, the Mediterranean, and then here would be Israel. Abraham had 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob had a son named Joseph, who ended up in Egypt, and then all the Jews went to Egypt for 400 years. And God sent a leader named Moses. And Moses said, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh said, "No." God sent the 10 plagues. You have the Passover. They cross the Red Sea. They go to Mount Sinai. That's where they get the law. The law tells them about the tabernacle, filled with Levites and priests, and also talks about the offerings and feasts. They started counting the faces, and they came to Kadesh, an oasis. They sent 12 spies into Canaan, but they didn't come back with a good report. 10 of them didn't. So they became wanderers, and then they died. And then at a place called Moab, we hear from Moses, who gives them the second law. And then Moses dies. So the next leader after Moses is named Joshua. They crossed the Jordan, fight the battle of Jericho, and then they divide and conquer. First the south, then the north. Then they divide and they settle.
Let's back up and remember the story so far. So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. And so through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and he brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died, and Israel's ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with 4 main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land, and then once they're there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites, and so they engage them in battle. Then after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, and then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. So let's dive in and we'll see how all of it flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death, and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. And the author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. So like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that they were given at Mount Sinai. And then Joshua sends spies into the land, just as Moses did back in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, except it goes way better this time. In fact, even some Canaanites turn and follow the God of Israel. Joshua then leads all Israel across the Jordan River and into the land. Just like the sea parted for Moses in the Exodus, so here the river Jordan parts and the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant across, leading all Israel with them. Now, in chapter 5, the story transitions. So the people look back to their roots as God's covenant people, and so the new generation is circumcised and they celebrate their first Passover in the land. But then they turn and prepare to go forward. And Joshua has this crazy encounter with a mysterious warrior, who, it turns out, is the angelic commander of God's army. And Joshua asks, "Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" And the warrior responds, "Neither," which shows that the real question here is whether Joshua is on God's side. It makes clear that this whole story is not about Israel versus the Canaanites. Rather, this is God's battle, and Israel is going to play the role of spectators or sometimes supporters in God's plan. which leads to the next section. We find stories about all these conflicts that Israel had with different Canaanite groups. And the first part retells the story of 2 battles in detail, and that's followed by a series of short stories that condense years of battles into a few brief summaries. So the first 2 battles are against Jericho and then Ai, and they offer these contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. At Jericho, Israel is to take a completely passive approach. So they let God's presence in the ark lead them around the city to music for 6 days. And just like Rahab turned to the God of Israel, maybe the people of Jericho would do the same, but they don't. And so on the 7th day, the priests blow the trumpets and the walls come falling down, leading Israel to victory. The point of the story is that God is the one who will deliver his people. Israel simply needs to trust and wait. Now, the next story of the battle at Ai makes the opposite point. So there's this Israelite named Achan, and he steals from Jericho some of the devoted goods that were to belong to God alone, and then he lies about it. It's a pretty lame move after all that God has done for Israel. And so Israel goes into battle with the city of Ai, and they're totally defeated. And it's only after humble repentance and severely dealing with Achan's sin that Israel gains victory. And so together, these 2 stories, they're placed right up front to make an important point. If Israel is going to inherit the land, they have to be obedient and trust in God's commands. They don't get special treatment. Now, the second part of this section begins with the Gibeonites, a Canaanite people group, and they do just what Rahab did as they turn to follow the God of Israel and they make peace with Israel. This is in contrast to all of these other Canaanite kings who start to form alliances and coalitions, and they want to destroy Israel. So Israel engages them in battle, and they win by a landslide. And so this whole section concludes with this summary list of all of these victories won by Moses and then by Joshua. Yeah. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're bound to wonder, like, didn't Jesus say to love your enemies? Why is God declaring war here? So first, why the Canaanites? The main reasons are actually given earlier in the biblical story. It's that the culture of the Canaanites had become extremely morally corrupt, especially when it comes to sex. Go check out Leviticus chapter 18. And they also widely practiced child sacrifice. Go see Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so God didn't want these practices to influence Israel. The Canaanites had to go. They show God bringing his justice on human evil at a unique moment in history and how he delivered Israel from being annihilated by the Canaanites. Now, let's go back to the book's design. After years of battles, we see an aging Joshua, and he starts dividing up the land for the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of this section is like lists of boundary lines. And let's be honest, it's kind of boring. It's like reading a map that has no pictures. But for the Israelites, these lists were super important. This was the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham that his descendants would inherit the promised land. And so now it was all coming to pass right down to the detail, which leads to the final section. Joshua gives 2 speeches to the people that are very similar to the final speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites. And so he calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods and be faithful to the covenant they made. If they do, it will lead to life and blessing in the land. But if they're unfaithful, Israel will call down on itself the same divine judgment that the Canaanites experienced. They'll be kicked off the land into exile. And so Joshua leaves Israel with a choice. What is Israel going to do? That's the big question that looms as the story ends, and that's the book of Joshua.
And then all the Jews went to Egypt for 400 years. And God sent a leader named Moses. And Moses said, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh said, "No." God sent the 10 plagues. You had the Passover. They crossed the Red Sea. They go to Mount Sinai. That's where they get the law. The law tells them about the tabernacle filled with Levites and priests, and also talks about the offerings and feasts. they started counting the faces, and they came to Kadesh, an oasis. They sent 12 spies into Canaan, but they didn't come back with a good report. 10 of them didn't. So they became wanderers, and then they died. And then at a place called Moab, we hear from Moses, who gives them the second law. And then Moses dies. So the next leader after Moses is named Joshua. They crossed the Jordan, fight the battle of Jericho, and then they divide and conquer. First the south, then the north. Then they divide and they settle.